Section 5 of the Book of the Ancient Greeks. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Book of the Ancient Greeks by Dorothy Mills. Part 2, Chapter 2, Greek Religion and the Oracles. The city dwellers in Greece lived in the plains separated from their neighbors by mountains, and this caused the development of a large number of separate communities, quite independent of each other, each having its own laws and government. But there were three things which all Greeks had in common wherever they lived. They spoke the same language, they believed in the same gods, and they celebrated together as Greeks their great national games. The Greeks called themselves Hellenes, and their land Hellas. Like the Hebrews and Babylonians, they believed that there had been a time when men had grown so wicked that the gods determined to destroy the whole race of man and to create a new one. A terrible flood overwhelmed the earth until nothing of it was left visible but the top of Mount Parnassus, and here, the old legend tells us, a refuge was found by two people, Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha, who alone had been saved on account of their righteous lives. Slowly the waters abated, until the earth was once more dry and habitable. But Deucalion and Pyrrha were alone, and did not know what they should do. So they prayed to the gods, and received as an answer to their prayer the strange command, quote, "Depart, and cast behind you the bones of your mother." End quote. At first they could not understand what was meant, but at length Deucalion thought of an explanation. He said to Pyrrha, "The earth is the great mother of all, the stones are her bones, and perhaps it is these we must cast behind us." So they took up the stones that were lying about and cast them behind them, and as they did so, a strange thing happened. The stones thrown by Deucalion became men, and those thrown by Pyrrha became women, and this race of men peopled the land of Greece anew. The son of Deucalion and Pyrrha was called Hellen, and as the Greeks looked upon him as the legendary founder of their race, they called themselves and their land by his name. These earliest Greeks had very strange ideas as to the shape of the world. They thought it was flat and circular, and that Greece lay in the very middle of it, with Mount Olympus, or as some maintained, Delphi, as the central point of the whole world. This world was believed to be cut in two by the sea and to be entirely surrounded by the river Ocean, from which the sea and all the rivers and lakes on the earth received their waters. In the north of this world were supposed to live the Hyperboreans. They were the people who lived beyond the north winds, whose home was in the caverns in the mountains to the north of Greece. The Hyperboreans were a happy race of beings who knew neither disease nor old age, and who, living in a land of everlasting spring, were free from all toil and labor. Far away in the south, on the banks of the river Ocean, lived another happy people, the Ethiopians. They were so happy, and led such blissful lives, that the gods used sometimes to leave their home in Olympus and go and join the Ethiopians in their feasts and banquets. On the western edge of the earth and close to the river Ocean were the Elysian Fields, sometimes called the Fortunate Fields, and the Isles of the Blessed. It was to this blissful place that mortals who were specially loved by the gods were transported without first tasting of death, and there they lived forever, set free from all the sorrows and sufferings of earth. It was a land where falls not hail nor rain nor any snow, nor ever wind blows loudly, but it lies deep-meadowed, happy. The sun and the moon and the rosy-fingered dawn were thought of as gods, who rose out of the river Ocean and drove in their chariots through the air, giving light to both gods and men. What kind of religion did the Greeks have? Now, religion may be explained in many different ways, and there have been many different religions in the world, but there has never been a nation that has had no religion. From the earliest times, men have realized that there were things in the world that they could not understand, and these mysteries showed them that there must be some being greater than man who had himself been created, and it is by what is called religion that men have sought to come into relationship with this being greater than themselves. The Egyptians, in their religious beliefs, had been very much occupied with the idea of the life after death. But at first the Greeks thought of this very little. They believed that proper burial was necessary for the future happiness of the soul, and want of this was looked upon as a very serious disaster, but beyond the insisting on due and fitting burial ceremonies, their thoughts were not much occupied with the future. The reason of this was probably because the Greeks found this life so delightful. They were filled with the joy of being alive, and were keenly interested in everything concerning life. They felt at home in the world. The gods in whom the Greeks believed were not supposed to have created the world, but they were themselves part of it, and every phase of this life that was so full of interest and adventure was represented by the personality of a god. First, it was the outside life, nature with all its mysteries, and then all the outward activities of man. Later, men found other things difficult to explain, the passions within them, love and hatred, gentleness and anger, and gradually they gave personalities to all these emotions and thought of each as inspired by a god. These gods were thought of as very near to man. Men and women in the heroic age had claimed descent from them, and they were supposed to come down to earth and to hold frequent converse with man. The Greeks trusted their gods and looked to them for protection and assistance in all their affairs, but these gods were too human and not holy enough to be a real inspiration or to influence very much the conduct of those who believed in them. The chief gods dwelt on Mount Olympus in Thessaly and were called the Olympians. Others had dwellings on the earth, in the water, or in the underworld. Heaven, the water, and the underworld were each under the particular sovereignty of a great overlord amongst the gods. Quote, 3 brethren are we, said Poseidon, Zeus and myself, and Hades is the third, the ruler of the folk in the underworld. And in 3 lots are all things divided, and each drew a domain of his own, and to me fell the hoary sea, to be my habitation forever when we shook the lots. And Hades drew the murky darkness, and Zeus the wide heaven, in clear air and clouds, but the earth and high Olympus are common to all. End quote. Zeus was the greatest of the gods. He was the father of gods and men, the lord of the lightning and of the storm cloud, whose joy was in the thunder. But he was also the lord of counsel and ruler of heaven and earth, and he was in particular the protector of all who were in any kind of need or distress, and he was the guardian of the home. The court of every house had an altar to Zeus, the protector of the hearth. A great statue of Zeus stood in the temple at Olympia. It was the work of Pheidias, and was considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. This statue was destroyed more than 1,000 years ago by an earthquake, but a visitor to Olympia in ancient times tells us how perfectly it expressed the character of the god. Quote, his power and kingship are displayed by the strength and majesty of the whole image, his fatherly care for men by the mildness and loving kindness in the face. The solemn austerity of the work marks the god of the city and the law. He seems like to one giving and bestowing blessings. End quote. Hera was the wife of Zeus. She was, quote, golden-throned Hera, an immortal queen, the bride of loud thundering Zeus, the lady renowned whom all the blessed throughout high Olympus honor and revere no less than Zeus, whose delight is the thunder. End quote. Poseidon went to Olympus when he was summoned by Zeus, but he was the god of the sea, and he preferred its depths as his home. His symbol was the trident, and he was often represented as driving over the waves in a chariot drawn by foaming white horses. All sailors looked to him for protection, and they sang to him, quote, hail, prince, thou girdler of the earth, thou dark-haired god, and with kindly heart, O blessed one, do thou befriend the mariners. End quote. Athena, the grey-eyed goddess, was the guardian of Athens, and she stood to all the Greeks, but especially to the Athenians, as the symbol of 3 things. She was the warrior goddess, quote, the savior of cities, who with Ares takes keep of the works of war, and of falling cities and the battle din. End quote. She it was who led their armies out to war and brought them home victorious. She was Athena Polias, the guardian of the city and the home, to whom was committed the planting and care of the olive trees, and who had taught women the art of weaving, and given them wisdom in all fair handiwork. She was the wise goddess, rich in counsel, who inspired the Athenians with good statesmanship, and showed them how to rule well and justly, and she was the Athena Parthenos, the queen whose victories were won, and who was the symbol of all that was true and beautiful and good. Apollo, the far darter, the lord of the silver bow, was the god who inspired all poetry and music. He went about playing upon his lyre, clad in divine garments, and at his touch the lyre gave forth sweet music. To him, quote, "Everywhere have fallen all the ranges of song, both on the mainland and among the isles. To him all the cliffs are dear, and the steep mountain crests and rivers running onward to the salt sea, and beaches sloping to the foam, and havens of the deep." End quote. When Apollo the far darter, quote, fares through the hall of Zeus, the gods tremble, yea, rise up all from their thrones as he draws near with his shining bended bow. End quote. Apollo was also worshipped as Phoebus the sun, the god of light, and like the sun, he was supposed to purify and illumine all things. Following Apollo as their lord were the Muses, 9 daughters of Zeus, who dwelt on Mount Parnassus. We are told that their hearts were set on song, and that their souls knew no sorrow. It was the Muses and Apollo who gave to man the gift of song, and he whom they loved was held to be blessed. Quote, "It is from the Muses and far-darting Apollo that minstrels and harpers are upon the earth. Fortunate is he whomsoever the Muses love, and sweet flows his voice from his lips." End quote. The muse who inspired man with the imagination to understand history aright was called Clio. The huntress Artemis, the sister of Apollo, was goddess of the moon as her brother was god of the sun. She loved life in the open air and roamed over the hills and in the valleys, through the forests and by the streams. She was the, quote, "goddess of the loud chase, a maiden revered, the slayer of stags, the archer, very sister of Apollo of the golden blade. She through the shadowy hills and the windy headlands, rejoicing in the chase, draws her golden bow, sending forth shafts of sorrow. Then tremble the crests of the lofty mountains, and terribly the dark woodland rings with din of beasts, and the earth shudders and the teeming sea." End quote. Hermes is best known to us as the messenger of the gods. When he started out to do their bidding, quote, "beneath his feet he bound on his fair sandals, golden divine, that bare him over the waters of the sea, and over the boundless land with the breathings of the wind. And he took up his wand, wherewith he entranceth the eyes of such men as he will, while others again he awaketh out of sleep." End quote. Hermes was the protector of travelers, and he was the god who took special delight in the life of the marketplace. But there was another side to his character. He was skillful in all matters of cunning and trickery, and legend delighted in telling of his exploits. He began early, quote, "born in the dawn," end quote, we are told. Quote, "by midday well he harped, and in the evening stole the cattle of Apollo the far darter." End quote. Hephaestus was the god of fire, the divine metalworker. He was said to have first discovered the art of working iron, brass, silver, and gold, and all other metals that require forging by fire. His workshop was on Mount Olympus, and here he used to do all kinds of work for the gods. Perhaps his most famous piece was the divine armor, and above all the shield he made for Achilles. Some great quarrel in which he was concerned arose in Olympus, and Zeus, in rage, threw him out of heaven. All day he fell until, as the sun was setting, he dropped upon the Isle of Lemnos. Athena and Hephaestus were always regarded as benefactors to mankind, for they taught man many useful arts. Hestia, the goddess of the hearth, played an important part in the life of the Greeks. Her altar stood in every house and in every public building, and no act of importance was ever performed until an offering of wine had been poured on her altar. Laughter-loving golden Aphrodite was the goddess of love and beauty. She rose from the sea born in the soft white foam. Quote, she gives sweet gifts to mortals, and ever on her lovely face is a winsome smile. End quote. To the ancient Greeks, the woods and streams, the hills and rocky crags of their beautiful land were dwelt in by gods and nymphs and spirits of the wild. Chief of such spirits was Pan, quote, the goat-footed, the two-horned, the lover of the din of the revel, who haunts the wooded dells with dancing nymphs that tread the crests of the steep cliffs, calling upon Pan. Lord is he of every snowy crest and mountain peak and rocky path. Hither and thither he goes, through the thick copses, sometimes being drawn to the still waters, and sometimes faring through the lofty crags. He climbs the highest peaks, whence the flocks are seen below. Ever he ranges over the high white hills, and at evening returns piping from the chase, breathing sweet strains on the reeds. End quote. These were the chief gods in whom the Greeks believed. How did they worship them? The center of their worship was the altar, but the altars were not in the temples, but outside. They were also found in houses and in the chief public buildings of the city. The temple was looked upon as the home of the god, and the temple enclosure was a very sacred place. A man accused of a crime could flee there and take refuge, and once within the temple, he was safe. It was looked upon as a very dreadful thing to remove him by force, for it was believed that to do so would bring down the wrath of the god upon those who had violated the right of sanctuary. In the houses, the altars were those sacred to Hestia, to Apollo, and to Zeus. The altar of Hestia stood in the chief room of the house. A libation was poured out to her before meals, and special sacrifices were offered on special occasions, always before setting out on a journey and on the return from it, and at the time of a birth or of a death in the house. The altar of Apollo stood just outside the door. Special prayers and sacrifices were offered at this altar in times of trouble, but Apollo was not forgotten in the time of joy. Those who had traveled far from home stopped to worship on their return. When good news came to the house, sweet-smelling herbs were burnt on his altar, and the bride took sacred fire from it to offer to Apollo in her new home. The Greeks had no stated day every week sacred to the gods, but during the year different days were looked upon as belonging specially to particular gods. Some of these days were greater than others and were honored by public holidays. Others caused no interruption in the everyday life. Priests were attached to the temples, but sacrifices on the altars in the city or in the home were presented by the king or chief magistrate and by the head of the household. The Greeks did not kneel when they prayed, but stood with bared heads. Their prayers were chiefly for help in their undertakings. They prayed before everything they did, before athletic contests, before performances in the theater, before the opening of the assembly. The sailor prayed before setting out to sea, the farmer before he plowed, and the whole nation before going forth to war. Pericles, the great Athenian statesman, never spoke in public without a prayer that he might, quote, utter no unfitting word. End quote. As time went on, the gods of Olympus seemed less near to mortal men, and they gradually became less personalities than symbols of virtues, and as such they influenced the conduct of men more than they had done before. Athena, for example, became for all Greeks the symbol of self-control, of steadfast courage, and of dignified restraint, Apollo of purity, and Zeus of wise counsels and righteous judgments. A particular form of worship specially practiced by the Athenians was that known as the sacred mysteries, which were celebrated every autumn and lasted 9 days. This worship centered round Demeter, and was celebrated in her temple at Eleusis, near Athens. Demeter was the corn goddess, and it was the story of her daughter Persephone, who was carried off by Hades, lord of the realm of the dead, that was commemorated in the sacred mysteries. Quote, her daughter was playing and gathering flowers, roses and crocuses, and fair violets in the soft meadow, and lilies and hyacinths, and the narcissus. Wondrously bloomed the flower, a marvel for all to see, whether deathless gods or deathly men. From its root grew forth 100 blossoms, and with its fragrant odor the wide heaven above and the whole earth laughed, and the salt wave of the sea. Then the maiden marveled and stretched forth both her hands to seize the fair plaything, but the wide earth gaped, and up rushed the prince, the host of many guests, the son of Cronos, with his immortal horses. Against her will he seized her and drove her off weeping and right sore against her will in his golden chariot, but she cried aloud, calling on the highest of gods and the best, and the mountain peaks and the depths of the sea rang to her immortal voice." Demeter heard the cry but could not save her daughter, and she went up and down the world seeking her. She reached Attica and was kindly treated, though the people did not know at first she was a goddess. When she had revealed herself to them, she commanded them to build her temple at Eleusis. But still her daughter did not return to her, and the gods of Olympus took no heed of her lamenting. Then she put forth her power as goddess of the corn, and she caused it to stop growing over all the earth. A fearful famine followed, and Zeus tried to persuade her to relent. But she declared that, she would no more forever enter on fragrant Olympus, and no more allow the earth to bear her fruit, until her eyes should behold her fair-faced daughter." At last Zeus consented to interfere, and sent Hermes to bring Persephone back to the earth. When Persephone saw the messenger, joyously and swiftly she arose, and she climbed up into the golden chariot, and drove forth from the halls. Nor sea, nor rivers, nor grassy glades, nor cliffs could stay the rush of the deathless horses," until they reached the temple where dwelt Demeter, who, when she beheld them, rushed forth to greet her daughter. But before leaving Hades, the god had given Persephone a sweet pomegranate seed to eat, a charm to prevent her wishing to dwell forever with Demeter, and it was then arranged that Persephone should dwell with Hades, the lord of the realm of the dead, for 1/3 of the year, and for the other 2/3 with her mother and the gods of Olympus. This was the story around which centered the worship of the sacred mysteries at Eleusis. There came a time when the worship of the gods of Olympus did not satisfy the longings of the Greeks for some assurance that the soul was immortal and that there was a life after the death of the body. Demeter grew to be a symbol to the Greeks of the power of the gods to heal and save and to grant immortality. Her story became an allegory of the disappearance of the corn and fruit and flowers in the winter and of their return in the spring, bringing with them gifts to men of hope and life. At the festival of Eleusis, a kind of mystery play on the whole legend was acted. All who attended the festival were required to prepare for it by a certain ritual of fasting and sacrifice, and it was believed that in the life after death all would be well with those who had taken part in the festival with pure hearts and pure hands. The greatest religious influence in Greece was probably that of the oracle. This was the belief that at certain shrines specially sacred to certain gods, the worshipper could receive answers to questions put to the god. In very early time, signs seen in the world of nature were held to have special meanings. The rustling of leaves in the oak tree, the flight of birds, thunder and lightning, eclipses of both the sun and moon, or earthquakes. It is easy to understand how this belief arose. A man, perplexed and troubled by some important decision he had to make, would leave the city with its bustle and noise, and go out into the country where he could think out his difficulty alone and undisturbed. Perhaps he would sit under a tree, and as he sat and thought, the rustling of the leaves in the breeze would soothe his troubled mind, and slowly his duty would become clear to him, and it would seem to him that his questions were answered. Looking up to the sky, he would give thanks to Zeus for thus inspiring him with understanding. On his return home, he would speak of how he had heard the voice of Zeus speaking to him in the rustling of the leaves, and so the place would gradually become associated with Zeus, and others would go there and seek answers to their difficulties, hoping to meet with the same experience, until at last the spot would become sacred, and a shrine would be built there, and it would at length become known from far and near as an oracle. Plato said of these beginnings of the oracles that, "For the men of that time, since they were not so wise as ye are nowadays, it was enough in their simplicity to listen to oak or rock, if only these told them true." Other places would in the same way become associated with other gods. until seeking answers at oracles became a well-established custom in Greece. The great oracles of Zeus were at Olympia, where the answers were given from signs observed in the sacrifices offered, and at Dodona, where they were given from the sound of the rustling of the leaves in the sacred oak tree. But the greatest oracle in all Greece was that of Apollo at Delphi. It was at Delphi that Apollo had fought with and slain the Python, and it was thought that he specially delighted to dwell there, and had himself chosen it as the place where he would make known his will. Quote, "Here methinketh to stablish a right fair temple, to be a place of oracle to men, both they that dwell in rich Peloponnesus, and they of the mainland and sea-girt isles, seeking here the word of wisdom. To them all shall I speak the decree unerring, rendering oracles within my wealthy shrine." End quote. Delphi had been sacred to Apollo ever since these legendary days, and a great shrine and temple was built there in his honor. When a Greek came to consult Apollo, he had first to offer certain sacrifices, and he always brought with him the richest gifts he could afford, which were placed in the treasury of the god. Then he entered the temple and placed his request in the hands of a priest, who took it into the innermost sanctuary and gave it to the prophetess, whose duty it was to present the petition to the god himself and receive the answer. In ancient times, it was believed that a mysterious vapor arose in this sanctuary through a cleft in the rocky floor, and that this vapor, enveloping the prophetess, filled her with a kind of frenzy, in the midst of which she uttered the words of the answer given her by Apollo. This answer was written down by the priests and often turned into verse by them, and then taken out to the inquirer. Sometimes these answers were quite plain and straightforward, such as the one which has remained true through all the ages. It was the oracle from Apollo at Delphi which said of the poet Homer, quote, "He shall be deathless and ageless for aye." But sometimes the answers were like a riddle that required much thinking over to understand, and sometimes they were so worded that they might mean either of two things, each the opposite of the other. The oracle at Delphi was frequently consulted by the Greeks at great crises of their history, and it had great influence. It was the priests who, in writing down the answer, really determined its nature. They were men who were in constant touch with distant places, they had had much experience with human nature, and they were well fitted to give guidance and advice in all kinds of difficult matters. The oracle at Delphi was thus a power in the worldly affairs of the Greeks, but it was more than that. It was also a source of moral inspiration. It encouraged all manner of civilization and the virtues of gentleness and self-control. It marked the great reformers with its approval. It upheld the sanctity of oaths. It encouraged respect and reverence for women. On one of the temples were inscribed the sayings, quote, "Know thyself," end quote, and, quote, "Nothing in excess," end quote. It was said that these had been placed there by the ancient sages, and in later times they became famous as maxims in the teachings of the great philosophers. The oracle was not always right in its interpretations. It sometimes failed in seizing the highest opportunities that lay before it. But as Greek history unfolds itself before us, we can see a gradual raising of moral standards, which was due in great measure to the influence of the oracle of Apollo at Delphi. End of section 5.